Joining us now, NBC News senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, also with us, senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, Andrea Kendall Taylor. She also served as a senior intel officer for nearly 10 years. Garrett, I'll come to you first. President Trump now says Zelensky and Putin need to meet alone. What's the latest that you're hearing, especially as the Kremlin is saying maybe, maybe not, maybe eventually?
Yeah, it does appear that the Kremlin is slow walking that meeting, Allie, which we've heard from the White House is something they've agreed to, but not necessarily specifically from the Russians. The White House is casting this move to now have first a Zelensky-Putin meeting before a meeting that would also involve President Trump as a positive sign that ultimately they believe many of the issues at play here will have to be worked out between the two European leaders, and that President Trump could then be brought in essentially as a closer. Here's how the president talked about it yesterday.
Now I thought it would be better if they met without me, just to see. I want to see what goes on. You know, they had a hard relationship, very bad relationship. And now we'll see how they do. And if necessary, and it probably would be, but if necessary, I'll go and I'll probably be able to get it closed. I just want to see what happens at the meeting. So they're in the process of setting it up, and we're going to see what happens.
Allie, I think it's also possible to look at this as something in which the White House doesn't necessarily want to get the president involved in a negotiation that might not go anywhere. They don't want him to own this conflict any more than he would already by being part of a failed first meeting. I think if that meeting between Putin and Zelensky looks like it's making progress, there might actually be an opportunity to end the war or at least pause it in a significant way. Then you'd see the president want to be associated with its success, if not necessarily responsible for its failure.
And recognizing that this summit may or may not happen, is there any indication on where that meeting could take place if it did occur?
Well, you alluded to it in the open. There's more than 100 countries where it won't. President Putin is under indictment, if you will, from the International Criminal Court that would compel those countries to arrest him on site if you are a member of that court. The United States is not. Saudi Arabia is not. A number of other countries are not. The two countries that are being mentioned, I think, most prominently in other reporting are Hungary. Their leader, Viktor Orban, is friendly with both President Trump and President Putin. Also, Switzerland has a long history of hosting these kinds of events, peace talks of different types. I'd also put on the list a couple of other Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, all places that the Trump administration is friendly with. But I'll remind you, Allie, that Alaska wasn't on our radar for this first meeting either. And so I wouldn't consider any of these this list exhaustive.
Yeah, nothing is firm until it's firm, and this meeting might not even be happening yet. But, Andrea, this comes as Zelensky says more than 60 drones and a ballistic missile were used in just one attack overnight. So do talks between an aggressor and their target tend to bear fruit? This is where the ceasefire, non-ceasefire conversation comes into play.
Well, I think so. For the time being, I think it is obvious that President Trump has taken Putin's side, that a ceasefire is not on the cards. And Trump has been quite clear that we're taking that out of consideration. And there certainly hasn't been any indication that the Russians are any closer to moving in that direction, as these attacks underscore. So to me, it seems clear that we're operating from this position now of where we're looking towards the next meeting. But I agree that it seems very unlikely that that meeting is going to occur anytime soon. From President Putin's perspective, meeting with Zelensky would undermine the narrative of Zelensky as an illegitimate leader and a puppet of the West. And so meeting with him would really hurt him in the eyes of the Russian elite and the Russian public. And so as we're seeing, it's just a kicking the can down the road kind of strategy. The Russians are indeed slow walking it, attaching all sorts of conditions. And meanwhile, Russia continues unabated with its strikes on Ukraine. And that's why it's so important in this intervening period that the United States and Europe continue to ratchet up pressure. We have to stop setting these distant deadlines and not applying costs in the run-up. I think only when Putin starts to understand that there will be costs and he can't continue this war indefinitely will we get any closer to any kind of genuine negotiations.
Yeah, and last hour, we were talking with Ambassador Taylor about the pressure that has been applied so far in the form of tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. That's just one piece of a potentially larger puzzle in urging Russia back to the negotiating table if it comes to that. But, Garrett, another looming issue here is security guarantees for Ukraine. President Trump putting a hard line on at least one option. Listen.
Nobody from America is being killed. We're not being killed. The United States soldiers aren't involved. We have no boots on the ground.
And as Ambassador Taylor pointed out to us last hour, that's not necessarily new, though the president did need to define that after sort of leaving the door open after questions being flung at him in the Oval Office. But then what is actually on the table here for the security guarantees, Garrett?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we candidly don't know the answer to it. Not having American troops on the ground takes one piece off the chessboard here, but that's not necessarily, the end of discussion here. The French, the Germans, some of these other European nations have suggested that they would be okay having their own people as peacekeepers in the country. But would this involve American air support, American forcing a no-fly zone, perhaps? What happens if an American plane gets shot down? What happens if a French soldier gets killed? What does that compel the United States to do? What about American equipment? Would we see more Patriot missile defense systems or things of that nature? All of this seems very much to be an open conversation, Allie, with kind of knock-on consequences depending on how far you take it. And so the specifics will matter here. And so far, the White House has not outlined them.
Garrett Haake, thank you. Andrea, I want you to take a listen to what President Trump said about his tactic for these talks. Watch.
Is there a method to this? In other words, you talk to the two main people first, then you talk to Nate. Is there a process here, or you just kind of go with the flow?
Well, it's probably instinct more than process. I have instincts. And, I've lived with my instinct about things. Even running for president, I had an instinct I'd win the first time. And I did even better the second time, as you know. I did much better.
Yeah.
But bad things happen.
Instinct more than process. What is Putin thinking hearing that?
Well, I mean, it's exactly what Putin would hope for, because I think we've seen from the beginning of this conflict that Trump's instinct is to align himself more with Russia's view of the war. And we had a reminder of that, I think, just today or yesterday when President Trump continues to reiterate this idea that Ukraine is to blame for the onset of this war. So we see that Trump's instinct, I think, is to align much more with Putin. I think he continues to hold this view of Russia as a great power. And so in his mind, his instinct, I think, is telling him that if you want to win the war, you have to put pressure on what is, in his view, the weaker party, and that's Ukraine. And so that's where the problem is, because for those of us who study conflicts, we understand that we won't get a genuine negotiation until there's a stalemate on the battlefield, until Putin understands that he can't continue the war indefinitely. And that will require very significant costs on the Russian side. And that so far has not been Trump's instinct. And so therefore, I think, we are today nowhere closer to peace than we were through all this flurry of diplomacy, because that instinct, I think, in this case, is not correct and is not in Ukraine or the United States' national interests.
And Trump, of course, fancies himself as the consummate deal maker. Or you even hear the way that he talks about it. It's less typical diplomatic terms, more just hard and fast deal making, talking about instinct, talking about getting people at a table and just talking it out. But I think that you bring up something interesting and important, Andrea, when you talk about the fact that he viewed Ukraine as the weaker party. And in large part, that's why European allies came to the table here at the White House to start the week, to show that that's where the coalition and the power actually is. We're going to see how this ends up working out. Andrea Kendall Taylor, thank you for joining us.